Without further ado, let me introduce our keynote speaker, James Forman, Jr. As you can see in your programs, he's a professor of law at Yale Law School, a graduate of Yale Law School, a former clerk on the U.S. Supreme Court, and our business and the professor business, it doesn't get much better than that. He is also a former public defender in Washington, D.C., and that clearly informs his understanding of criminal justice, and especially race issues, which he'll be talking to us about. He teaches entirely in the criminal justice area, constitutional law, race, class, and punishment, and a really interesting seminar, Inside Out, Issues in Criminal Justice, where Yale law students and male inmates in a Connecticut prison sit together to discuss issues of criminal justice, which must be a fascinating. I want to be a fly on the wall in that program. Maybe you could tape it. So, without further ado, James Forman, Jr.
Thank you, Richard, for that kind introduction, and Kevin and the other folks associated with Robina. Thank you for inviting me to join you today. When I wrote this book that came out in April, and I've been going on the road giving talks about it. And I was thinking about the fact that today was my last talk of 2017, my last trip. And this is a book that's about African American political power. It's about black elected officials. It's a book that's grounded in Washington, D.C., in Atlanta, Chicago, Harlem, Detroit. And I was thinking at one level that there's something incongruous about my last talk of the year in a book that's grounded in cities with African American majorities or close to it, to be coming to Minneapolis, which is an amazing city, but it's not a city that is associated with black political majorities, that's for sure. But it's also, I think, the book does bring out, and I'll emphasize today, national themes. So I think there's a connection to the work that y'all are doing and wrestling with here. I also think that there's something very fitting about being here at Robina in particular, because when I first was thinking about writing this book 4 or 5 years ago, and I just really had an idea in my head, and I hadn't presented it anywhere yet. I had just written a chapter. I was invited by Richard and Kevin to come and speak at an early Robina conference. And I got incredible feedback, and it really, in a lot of ways, kind of launched my thinking about the work. So I'm deeply appreciative of the work that Robina Institute has done for me personally to further this book, and has done on these issues. Richard, you'll be glad to know I've already filled out my donation form here, so they're there in your programs. Anybody that wants to support the Institute can do that. And I do love the title, Reversing Mass Punishment, because I think we are at a moment in this country's history when this is a question that's being seriously asked, seriously pursued, from activists on the street to policymakers to judges. And so this is a perfect time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start by talking a little bit about my book, the history of how we got here over the last 40 or 50 years through the lens of black communities in particular. And then I will spend the last portion talking about really the theme, the reversing part, the reversing mass punishment part, and some ideas I have about what we can do collectively in that direction. So my motivation for writing the book, my principal motivation, grew out of my experience as a public defender in Washington, D.C. There's history and argument in this book, but fundamentally it's a book of stories. And one of the stories is of a young man by the name of Brandon. And Brandon was my teenage client. Superior Court, Washington, D.C., had pled guilty to possession of a gun and possession of a small amount of marijuana. And he was facing sentencing. I was his lawyer. And I had taken the job because I viewed the work of fighting for a fairer criminal system as the civil rights issue of my generation. My parents met in the original civil rights movement. They met in SNCC, in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. My dad's African American, my mom is white. They're an interracial couple at a time when those marriages were illegal in many states in this country. And their generation profoundly and forever changed America. Theirs was the generation that marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Theirs was the generation that faced down Bull Connor's dogs. Theirs was the generation that came to D.C. 250,000 strong for the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. And they had made it possible for somebody like me, for African Americans of my generation, to live lives that were unimaginable to my father growing up as he did in de jure segregated Mississippi, de facto segregated Chicago. And at the same time, it was also clear to me that there was a lot of unfinished business in the civil rights movement, and the place where I saw the unfinished business playing itself out was in our criminal legal system. We didn't have the term mass incarceration, let alone the new term mass punishment. That term didn't exist in the mid-1990s when I became a public defender. It was created in the year 2000 to try to describe a phenomenon that people were starting to document. But we already knew, by the early 1990s, we already knew from research from the Sentencing Project that 1 in 3 young African American men was under criminal justice supervision nationally. We already knew that the United States had passed Russia and South Africa to earn the dishonor of the world's largest jailer. We already knew that we had 5% of the world's population and 25% of its prisoners. And I had seen this in my own lifetime, how it played out in my community. I grew up in a mostly African American, working class, borderline middle class neighborhood in Atlanta. In my neighborhood growing up, 2 blocks from my house were 2 enormous buildings in either direction. One was the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, and the other was a General Motors plant. This is late 1970s. By the time I'm graduating law school, mid-1990s, one of those buildings had shut down, and the other had built an addition. And if I needed to tell you which is which, you wouldn't be at this conference. So that reality brought me to be a public defender. It brought me to be standing next to Brandon. And I was asking for him to get probation. I had a letter from a teacher or a counselor at his school. It was his first arrest. The letters attested to his character. His mother and grandmother were sitting in the first row of the courtroom, right behind me. They had been there for every court hearing. They wanted him to come home. The prosecutor was asking for him to be locked up. She wanted him to go to a place called Oak Hill. And don't let the name fool you. Oak Hill was a dungeon, DC's juvenile prison. No functioning school, no job training programs. There were some things on paper. If you went downtown, they'd say, oh, we do this and this. But if you went out there, you saw it was a lie. Drugs and violence rampant. It was a place that young people always left out worse than when they entered. The judge that had to make the decision in the case, Judge Curtis Walker, and I should say now, it's a good point to mention, that I changed the names of everybody that I described in these courtroom proceedings, including the judges and the prosecutors. And I do that because I want to protect fully and completely the identities of my clients. So Judge Walker is not his real name, but he's a real judge. He's an African-American judge. That was not unusual in D.C. 40% of the Superior Court judges are African-American. Judge Walker looks at Brandon and he says, son, Mr. Forman's been telling me that you've had a tough life, that you deserve a second chance. Well, let me tell you about tough. Let me tell you about Jim Crow. Judge had been a child in those years. He proceeded to tell Brandon what it was like. And then he said, so here's the thing, son. People fought, people marched, people died for your freedom. Dr. King died for you. And he didn't die for you to be running and gunning and thugging and carrying on and embarrassing your family and embarrassing your community. No, that was not his dream at all. So I hope Mr. Forman is right. I hope you turn it around someday. But right now, today, in this courtroom, actions have consequences. And your consequences will kill. Locked him up. And I was so angry that day. But as I began to work through that anger, it's a work in progress, as you might have noticed, I began to realize that there was a story here that needed to be told because the judge wasn't alone. I told you that 40% of the judges in Superior Court African American. Well, the police chief was black, and the majority of the police department was African American, and the mayor was black, and the city council that had passed the gun and the drug laws that Brandon was sentenced under was a majority African American city council. And the chief prosecutor in the city was none other than somebody you all will know named Eric Holder. And so I realized that there was a story that needed to be written, that somebody needed to go out and try to figure out over the last 50 years, as the United States embarked on this experiment in harshness and mass punishment, the likes of which the world has never seen. No country in time of peace has ever tried to lock up so many people. How was it that so many in my own community, how was it that so many in the African American political leadership in Washington, D.C., and other cities like it, went along for the ride, decided these policies made sense? What happened? So that's the question of the book. And I knew that as I explored the question, that I had to do a couple things. One, I couldn't write from the stance of anger that I felt that day in court. I had to write from a stance of empathy and compassion. I actually had to try to understand the motivations and the perspectives of people that were making decisions that I thought either in retrospect or even at the time were mistakes. The other thing was that even though I wanted to write a book that focused centrally on African American characters, activists, mayors, police chiefs, leaders, citizens, I could never lose sight of and never let the reader lose sight of the larger structures of racism, systemic and institutional racism, the larger society that limited and constrained the choices that were available to the people that I was writing about. So this is simultaneously a book about decisions and choices that people made, and it's a book about the constraints and the limitations on their ability to choose. And the last thing that I knew that I had to do is as I went, I had to look for larger lessons. I had to look for aspects of the story that were relevant outside of majority African American communities. That's what I endeavored to do. So let me give you, in quick overview, the heart of the argument, how this came to be. The first thing that we have to understand is rising crime and violence and addiction and the fear and the anger that those generated in black communities around America, especially over this 50-year period, but especially in the 1980s, early 90s, the crack years, and in the 1960s, the heroin years. My students, they know from media representations, most of them aren't old enough to remember themselves, but they have some memory of crack. But what they don't know was that heroin was, in the 1960s, to black communities what crack would be a couple of decades later. The homicide rate in this country doubled in the 1960s. That's historically unprecedented as well. It tripled in Washington, D.C. It more than doubled in Chicago. And it wasn't just murder, addiction. So they test everyone entering the Washington, D.C. jail for substances. In 1963, they concluded that 4% of the people entering the D.C. jail were heroin addicts. By 1969, the 4% had become 45% in 6 years. That's an epidemic. And it's not just the numbers, it's also the response that it generated in the community. So the way I was able to write this book, in part, was because a number of elected officials donated their papers to local libraries. And those papers, they saved, in a couple of instances, not just their own legislative memos and bills proposed, but they also saved all their correspondence, all the letters they received from citizens, and their responses to those letters. And so it's this incredible social history of a community. So this is in 1970s, I'm talking about now, this is a 70% African-American city, Washington, D.C. That's why they called it Chocolate City. So these are black citizens writing to mostly African-American representatives. The Washington, D.C. City Council that comes in 1975, the first Home Rule City Council, 11 out of 13 members are African-American. And what do these letters say? People say, I don't know what's happened to us as a community. I feel like a prisoner in my own home. I feel like a stranger on my own streets. I can't take my child to school and walk down the street because they're selling drugs on the corner. And I can't leave them in the park after school because they're shooting in the park. And over again, they're saying, do something, do something. You have to do something about it. Now, who's receiving these letters? That's the second big argument in the book. Because the generation that's receiving these letters is the first generation of black elected officials to come into power in any number in this country other than a few years during Reconstruction. This is the generation after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There's an 800% increase in the 1970s and 1980s nationwide in African-American elected officials. This is a generation of people who, many of them are from the South, some of them were in the Civil Rights Movement. All of them remember the long history of under-enforcement and under-protection of the law in African-American communities that has been so much a part of our history. My dad used to tell me about this, and then I started doing the research and I saw it. He said, we didn't call the police in Mississippi, in Chicago, in a crime in a black neighborhood in 1940, 50. The police weren't going to come. And if they did, the one thing you could be sure of is they would make matters worse. They remember Southern sheriffs, not just in the South, but especially in the South, Southern sheriffs and Southern-minded sheriffs elsewhere, who said, asked about a homicide in a black neighborhood, they said, that's not a homicide. That's another dead black person. And they didn't use the words black person. So they know this history, they're formed by this history. Now they've come into office, they have some measure of power over local police, over local laws. And they're bound and determined with the power that they have to make the law responsive to and protect those citizens that are writing those letters, those citizens that wouldn't have even bothered to write 20 years earlier under Jim Crow because they would have known they weren't going to get a response. Okay, so crime is rising, addiction, violence, people are scared, people are pressing. The elected representatives want to do something about it, in many cases because of these racial justice considerations. But why police and prosecutors and prisons? Why is that the form of protection provided? That's not the only way to protect. In fact, those of you that live in some of the safest neighborhoods in your community probably don't think a lot about prosecutors and prisons. You may not see a lot of police officers, but you still feel pretty safe. So why that? So here's where the story, I said this is a story of African American elected officials and the citizens they represent, but it's also a story about the larger structures surrounding them and the constraints that they were under. So let's talk about some of those constraints. The first constraint that this group of officials is under is a historical one. They've been elected in the 1970s, 80s, and going forward into the 90s, they've been elected to represent communities that because of a history of racism, because of a history of Jim Crow, because of a history of segregation, because of a history of redlining where they wouldn't give loans to black borrowers in black neighborhoods, because of a history of intentional choices by the federal government to make decisions about various things, including, for example, where to put federal highways. We built a whole federal highway system in the 1950s, 1960s. If you look at, in most cities, where those highways were built, they were built disproportionately through what had been thriving black communities. In Atlanta, it was Auburn Avenue. They used to call it the Black Wall Street. Dr. King family home is nearby. 1950, 1960, had to put the highway somewhere. If any of y'all have driven through Atlanta, you have driven on I-75, I-85, 14 lanes, probably 22 lanes now. Atlanta's so crazy. Right through the middle of what had been the Black Wall Street, devastating that community. It had to be put somewhere. Well, where did it get put? It got put in the places where people had less power. And so this historical constraint means that this group of officials has been elected to represent communities that in many ways have been deprived of the resources that people who live in wealthier communities have come to take for granted. Second constraint is a political one, the structure of our political system. So African American political power is overwhelmingly local, disproportionately local. City councils, county councils. And one of the arguments in my book is that local policy matters more than we typically give it credit for when we talk about how we got mass punishment and how we're going to get out of it. But there are limits to what local government can do, and you see those limits over and over again in the book. So what you see over the last 50 years, African American leaders have adopted what I think of as an all-of-the-above strategy to fighting crime and violence. They want more police and more prosecutors, and sometimes they even said back in the 70s and 80s, more prisons. But they also want more jobs, more money for housing, more money for schools, more money for drug treatment, more money for mental health programs. They want national gun control. They're passing local gun control laws wherever they can. D.C., Chicago, Detroit, New York, trying in Atlanta. But they go to Congress and they say, we know that the local gun control laws by themselves aren't going to solve the problem. You need to pass national gun control to complement our efforts and to make them meaningful. They go to Congress and they say, we want a Marshall Plan for urban America. We want the United States government to do for black communities what it did for Europe after World War II, to rebuild, to reinvest, to revitalize. For 50 years, they go asking for all of the above. And for 50 years, they come back with money for one of the above. Law enforcement, police, prosecutors, and prisons. One last constraint that I want to mention. And this is a constraint that I want us all to grapple with because I think that it's one of the ones that is still with, all of them are still with us today, but this one especially so. They were constrained by their imaginations. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's a bunch of examples, but let me give you one. One of the people that I write about is a city council member by the name of David Clarke. Now, David Clarke, I told y'all that 11 out of 13 of the first city council are African American. David Clarke is one of the 2 white members. Very unusual biography for his time. Went to Howard Law School, worked for Martin Luther King when he got out of law school, became a lawyer for poor people, And then D.C. gets home rule. He says, I'm going to run for city council. He wins. David Clarke is not a drug warrior. In fact, his first legislative proposal is to decriminalize marijuana. In 1975, y'all. Almost passes. It doesn't. That's the topic of chapter 1 of the book, why this doesn't pass. But for our purposes, the point is he's not a drug warrior. Okay, now fast forward, early 1980s. Clarke's the chair of the city council now, and heroin, which had stepped back in the 70s, has kind of taken up again, taken off. And you see this uptick in letters from citizens, this time very much focused around heroin addicts. There's a junkie, this is the language of the letter, I don't endorse it. Junkie on my stoop. There's groups of junkies on the corner, nodding off. They're gathering in the alleys behind my house, my place of business. There's dirty syringes lying around. Now, David Clarke gets these letters, and he sends them to the head of the relevant government agency. He then gets a letter back saying, Councilmember Clarke, we've received your citizen complaints about addicts. We're on the case. Councilmember Clarke then takes all these letters and sends them back to the citizens. Good. Responsive. But who does this non-drug warrior send the letters of complaint to? Remember, the problem is addicts in public space. Does he send it to the Department of Mental Health, Addiction Services, social work, drug rehabilitation? No. Because even though he's not a drug warrior, he's an American, and like so many of us, he's bought into the idea that when you have a problem of addiction, when you have a problem of an addict in public space, the person that you call, the person you summon, is a police officer with a gun and with handcuffs and the power to arrest. And often, in many cases, in too many cities, the power to do nothing else. So that's what he did. He notified the police chief. And the argument in my book is that when we think about how we got mass punishment, it's so tempting to look for a particular edict from the White House, a particular speech, a particular piece of legislation. But that, in fact, the way this came to be was by thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of tiny decisions made across 50 states, made across 3,000 counties, made over 50 years, including ones that people don't even recognize that they're making at the time. David Clarke didn't think, I want to create mass incarceration. Just to the contrary. But it's these kind of tiny, in some cases unknowing and unwitting decisions that are the bricks that built the prison nation that America has become. So that's my book. They're going to be selling it over lunch. I'll be signing it later today. Now that I've told you all about it, you're probably like, well, I don't need to buy it. I just heard it. But there's more. There's more in the book. There's more stuff, I promise. Let's talk about what we can do about this, because that's what y'all fundamentally are here to think about. Reversing mass punishment. So let me say a couple of thoughts about kind of framing and then get into some details. The first thing I want to say builds off this question of imagination. Right? We have to cultivate our imaginations. And it builds off this point about small steps in local communities. This is a local problem. No place is immune. I know that y'all know this. But even in states that have relatively low overall incarceration rates, some of those states have the highest racial disparities in incarceration. Welcome to Minnesota. By some measures, y'all have the second or third greatest racial disparities in the incarceration rates in the country. So there's no place that is like, okay, that's cool. The Alabama, they need to deal with this problem, but we're good. We all have to. So that's one thing I think to keep in mind. Related to that, when I think about this problem, one of the things that happens when, we call this a criminal justice system, but everybody who's in it knows it's not a system. There's nothing systemic about it. You have whole groups of people that have almost no conversations with one another. Prosecutors don't talk to judges, and the judges have their domain, and they're not talking to legislators, and then nobody's talking to the probation and the parole officers and pretrial services. And then there's all these private citizens who make decisions about who to rent houses to, who to admit to their universities, who to hire as employees, right? Everybody that I just mentioned is a stakeholder in mass incarceration. Everybody that I just mentioned makes decisions that either accelerate or reverse this problem. But almost nobody is responsible for nobody's responsible for the entire problem. So as a result, that can lead to a kind of a stasis. And I see this when I talk to folks that work in the system because, no matter who you talk to in the system, you'll present evidence of racial disparity, and, you meet with probation officers and you talk about this problem and they say, oh yeah, it's really messed up. The judges need to do something different. And then you talk to the judges and they're like, yeah, this is terrible. It's really the prosecutor's problem to fix. And then you talk to the prosecutors and they're like, well, the problem is the police. The police just need to bring us different cases. And then you talk to the police and they say, well, it's not our choices, it's the families and how they're raising their children. So everybody, even among people who recognize the problem, want to kind of push the solution towards somebody else. And what I always think about is a conversation that I had with my mother. I was in high school, and I had moved to a new high school, and my mom had this way of seemingly always finding some of the, we moved a lot, and it was never a priority to her to find necessarily that school with the highest test scores in the city. Let me just put it like that. Anyway, I got to this new school, and I was trying to make my way. It was 10th grade, and there was I was in the bathroom. When you're new in school, you don't know which bathrooms you should go to and not go to. And I went and I saw this kid was being kind of bullied in the bathroom. It was nothing physical, but it was making fun of his hair and making fun of the way he dressed and the way he walked, and I felt really sick. And I left, and I got home, and I talked to my mom, and I told her the story, and because I didn't know the social context of the school, I didn't really know what to do. And so I had a lot of ideas, though, from my mom about things that she could do. I had thoughts about what the teachers could do, how they could handle lunch break differently and police the bathrooms differently. And I had ideas for what the principal could do. I had ideas for what my mom could do. She could go meet up with the principal. And my mom heard all of this gushing out of me. And she's like, that's really great. I'm interested. But let me just ask you one question. What are you going to do? And that's the question that I always want to come back to in this conversation, is for each of us to stop and ask ourselves, okay, what are we going to do? So let me put some ideas out on the table. For those that are working inside the criminal legal system, one thing that I really think that we have to think about is challenging the baselines that we've been working with. So when you're working in a system that has created mass punishment, it's not enough to just take what you've been given, the training that you've been given, the culture that you've been exposed to, the lessons that you've learned as an appropriate baseline. Because the baseline is the problem. So you can see this in a lot of concrete ways when you think about how to challenge. I was just talking to a group of judges in another jurisdiction. I won't name the jurisdiction, but it's a jurisdiction that has voluntary guidelines. It's a state jurisdiction, voluntary guidelines. And the judges wanted to talk about what they could do. And one of the points that I made in conversation with them is that the guidelines that they were working off of, which they, because when they came in, the guidelines were there, none of them had thought about the following fact. These guidelines were written in 1998. And they were written at the time, as guidelines often are, commission had come together and looked at sentencing practices from 1993 to 1997. And they had taken basically the middle ground of the sentencing practice, the 25 percentile and the 75 percentile. And they had said that's the lower range and the upper range for the guidelines. But 1993 to 1998 are not average years in American criminal justice. That is exactly the tail end of the crack years. It's when in DC, for example, the homicide rate was 5 times higher than it is today. DC was freaking out so much in 1993 that they were passing new mandatory minimums by the minute. They have a mandatory minimum for unarmed carjacking that nobody thinks makes any sense because they don't have a mandatory minimum for robbery. But if the robbery takes place in a car, they have this incredibly excessive mandatory minimum, and then they have a triple that mandatory minimum for armed carjacking, not for any thought process, but because there was a spate of carjackings in 1992, 6 in 2 weeks. And if that happens at a time when a city is in crisis, the legislators rush and they... So the point is, and it's not one that's limited to DC, the point is in many cases, the things that we accept as baselines are historically contingent artifacts. And that if we picked another 5-year period, they could easily go back and pick 1978 to 1983 and use that as the baseline. And if they did, their guidelines would all dramatically reduce. I think that there are examples like that woven in to the fabric of so many of the policies and practices and cultures of different aspects of our criminal justice system. So I would encourage those who are working in the system, so whenever you're given something that says, well, this is how we do it, to stop and say, well, right, but what is that based on? How did we come to this? Because if you work in a system that has produced historic levels of injustice, then to me the presumption should be that the historical baselines that we're working off of are themselves unjust and need to be reproven and rejustified for the current moment. Okay, so that's because I tried to come up with I asked the organizers the types of folks that would be here today. So I want to have something for folks in the criminal system. I also want to talk about for researchers, because they told me there's some researchers and here I think that there's a real role for those that are researchers now, researchers that are coming in, people that are graduate students or undergraduates, high school students for that matter, to think about for your future. So I think research has a really potentially powerful role to play. Think about one of the few success stories in recent years. One of the few success stories has been juvenile incarceration rates. We lock up half as many young people today as we did 20 years ago. That's amazing. Right? Just think about that. There's no other statistic that anybody is going to give you today that is a historical trend on criminal justice policy that is equivalently positive. It's going to be gloom and doom for the most part. And that's just because that's the reality. But here's a huge success. Well, researchers played a very important role in this because researchers presented a whole series of findings that have been very impactful in the juvenile justice field. One set of findings has been around how there's no extra public safety benefit beyond at most 6 months of incarceration. So these are for kids that a judge feels like, well, this person has to be locked up for some period of time. Probation is not an option. And there are going to be those people that at least some judges are going to feel that way about. But they went out and demonstrated that nothing beyond 6 months provides any benefit on the exact metric that the judge purported to care about. And I've talked to judges and I've talked to legislators who have reported the power and influence of that set of studies, as well as a set of studies that you're probably familiar with around adolescent brain development and all of the things that got picked up by the Supreme Court. But all of that started as bodies of research, as individual research projects to even become bodies of research. And I can tell you from going around the country and talking to judges that the judges that work in adult court are craving things like this now for their field. Every time I talk to judges, I hear things like, I want and I need studies that will help me make the case, right? That will help me make the equivalent case about whether it's brain development. So people are starting to work on this for young adults who aren't kids, but like the 18 to 25, right? That's an emerging area. Judges are asking the question in the adult system, what's the equivalent? They are looking for research where they can say, because when they're imposing sentences, especially if they're going against the grain, especially if they're going outside of these guidelines, which we want them to do, they have to have a reason, they have to have a rationale, right? But if they have a study that they can point to that says, listen, nothing beyond X period of time has any deterrent benefit, or at most has a marginal public safety benefit, right? And there's an additional line that judges are desperate for, which is that public defenders come to court all the time and they talk about the harms of incarceration, but there's typically not that much behind that. And at one level you could say, well, all right, but it's kind of an obvious point, like, what more do I need to say? But for judges that you want to persuade, there is more that we need to say. And we need to try to figure out ways of concretely showing how not only is there no benefit, but beyond particular points of time, any additional period of time is actually harmful. And harmful, again, harmful to the individual, but also harmful on public safety grounds. So I think that's another really area that's kind of ripe for researchers to explore. And we can talk more. I'll be here throughout the day. We can talk more about kind of other ideas. I'd love to hear kind of what y'all are thinking about. Let me mention one other idea, and this isn't an idea for researchers. It's not researchers can be part of this, and those in the criminal system can be part of this, but this is broader. This is for everybody. This is for all of us. And it has to do with coming together as a community to both envision and then build and support and sustain alternatives. So when I talk, again, to folks that are prosecutors and judges, the people that have right now the most power in determining how long people go to prison for, there's a growing sense, at least in some places, and not everybody has learned this, but more and more people are learning that for folks who have relatively low-level offenses, drug offenses, nonviolent offenses, the reform movement over the last 10 or 15 years has done a pretty good job of persuading more and more people in the system that for those individuals, it doesn't make sense to lock them up. There's a group of people at the deep end, convicted of murder, convicted of violent rape, or any rape. All rape is violent. And where judges feel like, well, there's not much that you're going to be able to tell me about that. But then there's the heartland of who's in our prisons, because neither of those groups is the majority of people in prison. The single biggest category of offense in our prison system is robbery. Right? And so it's this group of people right now that we need to start developing community-based interventions and community-based alternatives. A lot of the traditional intervention programs have shied away from people that have committed offenses like robbery, like burglary. When I would try to find programs for my clients in Washington, D.C., you tell a very compelling story, and then they say, what's the charge? Armed robbery. I mean, they wouldn't hang up, but they'd say, sorry, Mr. Forman, then they'd hang up. So building and sustaining, and there's some interesting models around. There's Common Justice in Brooklyn. There's a program I've been looking at in Boston called College Bound Dorchester. There's a program out of Richmond, California. There are seeds that are sprouting up. But these programs are hard to develop. They're hard to build a constituency for. And the only way they're going to get off the ground is if a whole community comes together, right? If a group of people in this room gets together, either in a breakout session or after this, and says, we're going to collectively build something like this in Minneapolis or St. Paul, or we're going to build on what's already there and make more spaces available. Because when we start to develop this kind of robust set of alternatives, then not only do judges have other options, not only will prosecutors be persuaded, okay, in this case, maybe I'll do something else. We not only reverse mass incarceration, but we also reverse mass punishment, because in some of these instances, like for example in Common Justice in Brooklyn, if you go through their restorative justice program, which includes slots for violent offenders, you come out with no conviction on your record. The last thing I'll say, and then I'm going to stop, is not a particular idea, but it's really a way of thinking about fighting for change against a system that is both unjust and appears insurmountable. And I think about this a lot. I think about a conversation I had with my father before he passed. And we had watched a film about the civil rights movement. And when the film was over, I asked him what he thought about it. Having been in the movement, what was his opinion? And he said that he liked it. He liked that they were presenting this material on film. He said, a lot of people, more people watch movies than read books, so it makes it accessible. I probably should have thought about that before writing a book. And he said the thing he didn't like about it was that they made it seem like everybody was in the movement. And he said it wasn't like that. We were unpopular. We were a minority. And he told me these stories about going on college campuses trying to recruit students to join the movement and being run off the campuses by administrators that they didn't want their students being dragged into the civil rights movement. Somebody recently sent me some statistics to back up his point. Freedom Riders. Everybody knows who the Freedom Riders are, right? So the Freedom Riders, 1961, do you approve or disapprove of what the Freedom Riders are doing? Gallup poll. 22% approve. 61% disapprove. March on Washington, 1963. 250,000 people were there. Now everybody says they were there. Later, 1963. What are your feelings about the proposed mass civil rights rally to be held in Washington, D.C. on August 28, 1963? 23% favorable, 60% unfavorable. But now everybody was on board. And this is my dad's point, right? His point was that when you're facing an unjust system, when you're facing a system that's so entrenched, like slavery, like Jim Crow, like mass incarceration or mass punishment today, I would argue, though it appears insurmountable. And then for those few who decide to ignore that and buck the trends and buck the public opinion and be the bold minority and take risks, eventually you prevail. And then when you do, they make a movie about it And they make it seem like everybody was with you from the beginning. So I don't know what's the group of people in this room that's going to come together and come up with the idea, come up with the innovation, come up with the new insight or new movement, new form of activism, because it requires both inside and outside. But somebody is, or some group of you is. You're going to make it so that Minnesota doesn't have the second or third highest disparities, racial disparities in the country. And when you do, and they make your movie, Kevin and Richard and I will be there in the front row with popcorn. Thank you. All right, well, if there's no questions, people should go get coffee.
How about one question?
I'll take one question.
Okay. First of all, I'm not your agent, but let me tell everybody here, there is so much more in the book. It's a fabulous book on so many levels, including your recounting of, the sins of Eric Holder and Barack Obama. You take on, some really well-meaning people who have also contributed to the problem. But what I want to ask you is this. I was going to ask you what your plan was, but you've given us some pretty good plans. Am I right, this is not just a question for you, but if I'm right, that the combination of relatively low incarceration rates in predominantly northern or more progressive, if you will, states is frequently accompanied, as in Minnesota, by a very high racial disparity? Is that an opening, beyond just Minnesota, but Massachusetts, New York, two states I'm familiar with, Connecticut, other states, to build upon what is a relatively benign political criminal justice climate, to bring it beyond just one state's problem?
I think it is an opportunity. First of all, thank you for your comments about the book, and I really appreciate them. I think it is an opportunity. In some ways, the challenge in a state like Minnesota, but not limited to Minnesota. This would be true of Connecticut as well. In some ways, the challenge is easier than it is in a state like Georgia, just to pick, the state that I grew up in. Because Georgia, although it has racial disparities as well, Georgia also has a high rate of incarceration for its white citizens. So there isn't even a group where you could point to and say, okay, well, let's make that our goal, right? If we reduce the African-American incarceration rate in Georgia to match the white incarceration rate, that would be a tremendous progress, and we'd still have a lot of work to do. But in some of the low incarceration states like Minnesota, you can set as your goal, you already know how to do it because you're doing it for a whole bunch of your citizens. That's number one. And number two, you're talking about a smaller number of people because you're talking about smaller minority, because the racial minorities in the state are a lower overall percentage of the state, right? There aren't actually as many people for who you have to treat differently. So the number of alternative interventions that I described, right, that you need to develop in that kind of community are fewer. So yeah, I think it's an opening. I think it's opening for an individual state, and then I guess to conclude with maybe part of what was the thrust of your question, I also think it would be a really interesting opportunity for a group of states that are similar in that way to come together and say, we're 5 states that have relatively low overall incarceration rates and relatively high disparities in our incarceration rates. So let's, as a group, come together and try to study practices that would work in all 5 states. I mean, there is examples of, this is at a different level, but for example, there aren't that many integrated school systems in the United States because of racial segregation and Supreme Court decisions and otherwise. But there are a number of them, and they are self-consciously a cohort. And they come together and they meet and they convene and they try to develop a set of practices that would work well. And they try to build, oh, okay, well, you're doing something well over here in Berkeley, California, that maybe we can learn from in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, North Carolina. So yeah, I think it's a potentially a great opportunity.
Thank you.
I think they're asking people to go back to these microphones.
So I was struck by what you said about the idea that there's all these kind of local small decisions that add up to what looks like a system. And I was thinking about how hard it is to create a system intentionally. So I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about, when you think about the system, what are kind of the root causes that cause all these isolated decisions to be made in similar ways to add up to what looks like a system?
I think, so if we're going to look nationally, I think there's some of the kind of fundamentals, if you will, are some things that I talked about in some ways in my remarks. But so first of all, you have rising crime and violence and the fear that that creates. Second of all, you have racism. You have institutionalized racism. You have structural racism, so that when people are, and you see this, I mean, there's millions of examples of this, but just to pick one of the more recent studies that I was reading just a couple of days ago, a study by a group of researchers that shows not only is there bias, not only is there black-white bias, but there's tremendous skin color bias even among African-American defendants. So along the range of, as your skin color darkens, you receive worse outcomes in the criminal system. You receive longer sentences and you're more likely to be found guilty. And so at every level, right, when you're, I guess if you want to even to step back one step further, when you say like foundationally, right, foundationally, I think in this country the question is slavery. Foundationally, that as a nation we have not begun to grapple with the legacy of slavery and the very specific and concrete ways in which it fuels and sustains racial biases that continue to this day. So if you think about stereotypes, think about racist stereotypes, what they are. Every one of them is rooted in and has its rationale in slavery, right? The physical brutality that's imposed on slaves to force them to work. Well, blacks are lazy, so that's why that justifies doing that. They don't care about learning, that justifies denying folks an education. They have higher thresholds for pain, that justifies extreme beatings. They don't care about their children, that justifies taking children away at the auction block. So if you want to ask me about like foundational, I think that when as a society you have had to justify to yourself a system as brutal as slavery, that creates a set of ideologies and cultures and beliefs that doesn't evaporate just when the institution ends. And so that is at the very root, in my opinion. And then you just kind of work forward from there.
Thank you very much for those comments. And kind of piggybacking off of what you had just said, I guess I have two questions. First off, how do you reconcile the argument put forward by the new Jim Crow in saying that it's institutionalized racism from the top down versus the comments about how everything is done from the bottom up through small decisions? And secondly, this is off a tangent, but when you are talking about how to make changes within the system, I'm trying to figure out how that actually can happen, seeing as the case law is so set, the laws are so set, and the sentencing guidelines are so set. I remember oftentimes when I was a clerk, the judge was hamstrung by these guidelines and this precedent that he couldn't actually do anything, even if he wanted to do, because if he made his decision, it'd be appealed and it'd be reversed on those bases. And I was wondering if there are any real steps or things that we can do within the justice system because of those set, I guess, values.
Does Minnesota have mandatory guidelines? Yes, you're nodding. Okay. I don't live here, so every state, right, has huge variety in its criminal system, so I just didn't know. So let me respond to both of those questions. I'll just take the second one first. I think in situations where, and again, the details of mandatory guidelines always vary. What is when can you depart? When can you vary? I don't know the particulars, so I can't give you any kind of fine-grained answer there. But I can say that if you look at the federal system, so the one thing that judges can always do is raise their voices and raise their concerns in published opinions, in statements from the bench, and in op-eds and other publications. And there's a precedent for this, and it's a powerful precedent. The country's view of the war on drugs has changed dramatically over the last 20 years. And one of the key forces in that was federal judges who first won, then two, then it became a trickle, then it became, a gushing stream of voices, starting in the early 1990s, raising their voices, imposing sentences that they thought were unfair, but making it very public and really detailing the unfairness. The judges can't rewrite the law, but what they can do is they can set the agenda and they can influence public opinion and they can let legislators know there's a real problem here that you might not even be aware of. So because legislators aren't in court, right? They don't actually, Richard said this in the beginning, we don't know, or actually I think it was former Chief Justice, we don't know, most people don't know how the system is operating. So, okay, you're gonna have to, you just have to tell the questioners. So that's right, and so you raise your voice. So any judge, it really frustrates me when judges say they're hamstrung because people don't seize the power that they have. You see that over and over again. You're not hamstrung. Yes, you may have to impose this sentence, but nothing is stopping you from talking about that. And then nothing is stopping you from talking about it again the next day, and the next day, and the next day. On your first question, I think that they're very complementary. Right? I think that that multiple things can be going on at the same time. I stress the aspect of it that I stressed in part because I don't think people really had seen that before. I don't think that before people had really identified all of these small, tiny steps and how they add up. So I really viewed myself as kind of adding to that. But I take as a given, right? I take kind of as foundational the analysis that focuses on institutional racism. That's why you've heard me say it multiple times in this talk. So I take all of that as a clear starting point, and then I want to say, and what else is going on? What more? Right? Because there's always, right, that's the role of the academic is to push further and look for more. Now, I'm receiving a note here from the front that says that the time is up. So I am going to apologize to the two people that are still standing there. I'm happy to talk to you afterwards, or if you want to each brief take 30 seconds and put your question out so at least the room can kind of hear the benefit of it, your thought, and then we can continue the conversation collectively going forward.
Thank you. I'll just, it's just as a question, I don't even know how much you've looked at this, but I'm thinking about the criminal justice system as I understand some of the evolution now, and this idea that it's also becoming a warehouse for people with mental health issues.
Yes.
And I'm just curious, and this is maybe just something to think about, is the extent to which, I mean, there are the extreme racial disparities and issues that have that historical background, and then also seeing this mental health crisis, and just curious to the extent that there is overlap, or are they, should we think about them differently? And obviously substance abuse and other kinds of things like that have a mental health component as well. But I'm just thinking about where we are now and some of the themes that we're seeing now. So.
I was just wondering about, to the extent that systemic racism its impacts seem largely economic, between the redlining, between building highways through black communities, between prison removing, a potential income earner from a household. And then in Minnesota, in addition to having a very high amount of disparity in our prison system, we also have a lot of economic disparity on a racial basis. We have a lot of economic disparity in the black community especially. And so I was wondering to what extent you think economic interventions might be helpful in both sort of remedying the impacts and then also potentially reducing the sort of burden of mass incarceration insofar as we see a lot of crime coming out of poorer neighborhoods. So.
Incredible questions. I wish I had time to answer them. The answer is yes and yes, but I'll say much more in person. Thank you.